Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 55 in our History Bites series. Today we will discuss the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Potomac to effectively end the American Civil War. During the siege of Petersburg in Virginia from June 1864 to April 1865, Lee had about 60,000 men under his command to oppose more than 100,000 Union troops. General Lee's final campaign began on March 25, 1865, with a Confederate attack on Fort Stedman near Petersburg. On April 1st, a Union victory at the Battle of Five Forks made it possible for Grant's forces to wrap around Petersburg, leaving Lee's entrenchments vulnerable. When Federals broke through Confederate defenses at Petersburg the next day, Lee was forced to evacuate. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia stumbled westward through the Virginia countryside, stripped of food and supplies. At one point, Union cavalry forces under General Philip Sheridan had outrun General Lee's troops, blocking their retreat and taking approximately 6,000 prisoners at Sailor's Creek. Confederate desertions were mounting daily, and by April 8th, the rebels were almost completely surrounded. The Confederate Army's retreat moved southwest along the Richmond and Danville Railroad. Heavily outnumbered by the enemy and low on supplies, Lee was in dire trouble. Nevertheless, he led a series of grueling night marches, hoping to reach supply trains in Farmville, Virginia, and eventually join Major General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina. Union troops captured the valuable supplies at Farmville on April 7th. Grant, realizing that Lee's army was running out of options, sent a letter to Lee on April 7th requesting the Confederate general's surrender. Quote, "The result of last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle," Grant wrote. "I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia." While Lee did not agree with Grant's opinion of the hopelessness of his army, he did respond asking what terms Grant was offering. On April 8th, the Confederates discovered that their army was blocked by Federal cavalry. But Grant had anticipated Lee's attempt to escape and ordered two corps, the 24th and 25th, under the commands of Major General John Gibbon and Brevet Major General Charles Griffin, to march all night to reinforce the Union cavalry and trap Lee. At dawn on April 9th, the remnants of Major General John Brown Gordon's corps and Major General Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry drove off the Federal cavalrymen. Upon capturing the ridge that the Yankees had defended, the Confederates realized that they had been gravely mistaken. Gibbon and Griffin's corps had completed their night marches and promptly drove back the weary rebels. After this disaster, Lee remarked, quote, "There is nothing left to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." End quote. With no remaining options, Lee sent a message to Grant announcing his willingness to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. Soon after entering the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee's aide, Charles Marshall, happened upon a homeowner, Wilmer McLean. In the summer of 1861, Wilmer McLean and his family lived in Manassas, Virginia. His house was on the outskirts of that battlefield and was used as General P.G.T. Beauregard's headquarters. After the battle, McLean began selling sugar to the Confederate Army and moved to Appomattox Courthouse, where he believed he would be able to avoid the fighting and the Union occupation which impeded his work. McLean showed Marshall an unfurnished and somewhat run-down house. After being told that would not do for such an important occasion, he offered his own house for the surrender meeting. After seeing the house, they accepted and sent a message back to Lee. After the war, McLean would famously observe that, quote, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor," end quote. Lee arrived at the McLean house sometime after 1 o'clock and waited there with Marshall and one of Grant's staff officers, Orville Babcock. Grant and his staff arrived at McLean's parlor half an hour later from the west after riding dozens of miles around the two armies that morning. Grant was uncertain how to bring up the subject of surrender, so after introducing his staff and the army commanders with him, he brought up the Mexican War and the brief meeting the two men had then. Grant remarked later of the event in his memoirs, quote, "What General Lee's feelings were I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result and was too manly to show it. Whatever his feelings, they were entirely concealed from my observation. But my own feelings, which had been quite jubilant on the receipt of his letter, were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who were opposed to us." End quote. Eventually, Lee said they should get to the business at hand. In his order book, Grant quickly wrote out the terms, which had already been outlined for Lee in the letters the two generals exchanged over the previous 2 days. Generously, all officers and men were to be pardoned, and they would be sent home with their private property. Most important to the men were the horses, which could be used for a late spring planting. Officers would keep their sidearms, and Lee's starving men would be given Union rations. By 3 p.m., the formal copies of the letters indicating the terms and acceptance of the surrender were signed and exchanged, and General Lee left the McLean house to return to his camp. Horace Porter, one of Grant's staff officers, recorded that Lee paused at the top of the stairs and energetically, quote, "smote" his hands together 3 times. Grant and his staff followed him and removed their hats as a respectful farewell gesture, which Lee returned in kind before riding down the stage road. Firing of salutes spontaneously rang out as news of the surrender reached nearby Union lines. At once, Grant sent out the order, quote, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again, and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." End quote. The official copies of the surrender terms, signed by Lee and Grant, were drafted by Grant's personal military secretary, Lieutenant Colonel Eli S. Parker. Parker was a Seneca Indian chief from New York who had studied law. He became friends with Grant after the Mexican-American War, and Grant secured an officer's commission for him. He accompanied Grant to the McLean house on April 9th and witnessed the surrender. Parker would eventually rise to the rank of brigadier general. Grant met with his staff and commanders briefly before also leaving for his temporary headquarters a short distance down west of the village. Grant sent a message via the newly repaired telegraph lines at Appomattox Station to President Lincoln that Lee had surrendered. Within hours, the news was being shouted in the streets in Washington, D.C. Later that night, the 6 commissioners for the surrender met in the McLean house and had to bring a table with them, since the room had been largely stripped bare by Union officers purchasing or otherwise acquiring souvenirs from the McLean's home. In this commissioners' meeting, they worked out the details of supplying the Confederates, printing and signing paroles, and the format for the formal surrender of weapons and other military property. Under the supervision of Major General George Sharp, around 30,000 parole passes were printed in the Clover Hill Tavern, and 28,231 paroles were issued to the Confederates between April 10th and April 15th. The next day, April 10th, Grant met briefly with Lee on the eastern edge of the village. Grant apparently hoped to persuade Lee to influence other Confederate forces to surrender, but Lee refused. Grant left Appomattox to continue the work of ending the war. Lee returned to his headquarters where he attempted to remain isolated, refusing to meet with most of the Union officers who wanted to speak with him. Also on April 10th, Lee directed Lieutenant Colonel Marshall to write a farewell address to the Army of Northern Virginia, what became known as General Order No. 9. In his final formal address to the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee took responsibility for making the decision to surrender to spare further suffering to his men, who he then praised for their constancy and devotion to the Confederacy. Lee attributes the Confederacy's defeat to being compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. On April 12th, 4 years to the day that the war began when Fort Sumter was bombarded, the Army of Northern Virginia officially surrendered their arms and battle flags to the Army of the Potomac. The surrender was a highly emotional affair for the participants, many of whom had been fighting for 4 years. Soldiers on both sides cheered and cried, often at the same time, upon hearing the news. The formal ceremony and collection of weapons was under the supervision of Brigadier General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. As ranks of Confederate soldiers came forward to hand over their weapons and flags, Chamberlain ordered his men to salute their defeated adversaries as a gesture of respect. As Chamberlain recalls the moment, quote, "At the sound of that machine-like snap of arms, General Gordon started, caught in a moment its significance, and instantly assumed the finest attitude of a soldier. He wheeled his horse, facing me, touching him gently with the spur so that the animal slightly reared, and as he wheeled, horse and rider made one motion. The horse's head swung down with a graceful bow, and General Gordon dropped his sword point to his toe in salutation." End quote. Other witnesses also reported that interactions between Yankees and rebels were almost entirely kind and friendly. News of the surrender traveled slowly. Although scattered resistance continued for several weeks, there were 6 battles that took place after Appomattox, with the final skirmish of the Civil War occurring on May 12th and 13th at the Battle of Palmetto Ranch near Brownsville, Texas. But for all practical purposes, the Civil War had come to an end. President Abraham Lincoln only enjoyed victory for 5 days. On April 15th, Lincoln succumbed to the bullet wound that was inflicted on him the night before by John Wilkes Booth while the president was watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The nation mourned their fallen president, and it put a pall over the victory that Lincoln struggled so hard to achieve. However, the dignity and respect shown by both Grant and Lee at Appomattox has been observed as the beginning of the reunification of America. After such a long, bloody war and a particularly grim retreat, the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia has been referred to as the Gentleman's Agreement, a testament to the character of these 2 great men. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.